I believe we are live. I'm just going to refresh the YouTube page to make sure that you can all see and hear me. Drum roll. Excellent. Hello everyone. Welcome back to Tomlinson Talks for this cold and rainy February Tuesday. I hope that you're all settling in, getting cozy, and while people trickle in, we'll do a few announcements. Tonight we're going to be talking about Matt Goodwin standing as the candidate in the Gorton and Denton by-election, whether or not the British right should be falling in behind him. It's kind of anodyne to even talk about, really, because it's only people that live in the constituency that can actually vote there, but the broader implications for whether or not you should be supporting a Reform candidate at this stage in British political discourse, given their slump in the polls, given Nigel Farage's trips out to Abu Dhabi and Davos, given the perception that Reform are playing ship of Theseus with the Conservative Party and just making themselves the teal Tories 2.0, and whether or not people's concerns about entryism into any right-wing populist movement are founded, because, full disclosure, I know Matt personally, I've known him for a couple of years, I've even written for his Substack before, not that you would be able to find which piece it is, keep you guessing. And I can attest to the sincerity of his conversion, but there are a lot of eyebrows raised about that conversion, given about 10 years ago he was working for the Cameron government on Islamophobia boards and writing papers for Chatham House about how to infiltrate and sabotage right-wing populist movements. So, I'm not saying the paranoia doesn't have any foundations, but we'll be going through that, as well as Advance UK choosing to stand their own candidate. Before we do so, I have a confession to make, ladies and gentlemen. I did have a blue quarter zip on earlier, just because I've worn a couple. My wife says I have dad energy when I wear it, so I'm sort of, cultivating their aura ahead of God willing, us starting our family today, and I was gonna go live, and then I realized the optics. So, mea culpa, you're gonna have to settle in with this cozy navy jumper instead. I still like my suits and ties, but it's winter, you're gonna have to forgive me some comforts. The standards have been lowered, but hopefully the quality of the content remains high. Speaking of quality content, I've got through my writer's block. Admittedly, it was a rough December. Hopefully you can understand why. And I did an accompanying Substack piece to the video, which did very well, given the topic that I put out about 2 days ago, about why the right has a straight white man problem, and the fact that every institution on the ostensible right has failed to cultivate the wealth of young male talent, largely because they don't want to be called names by the left, and so launder their opinions through women and minority spokespeople, but also because their genuine liberal priors mean that they recoil in horror from the recognition by any Gen Z man worth his salt that identity politics is the game of the day, and if you aren't engaging in identifying yourself as a constituency with collective interests and then taking your own side, you're doomed to lose, I'm afraid. So, hopefully you enjoy that. It's free for everyone, but if you do join my Substack, then you have access to the Substack subscribers chat. We're trying to make that a bit more active. You can just shoot questions to me in there, and I will respond. Also, building up Rumble, because ahead of the 2026 midterms, let's be fair, monetization is probably not the most secure thing on YouTube. They were spooked into being less censorious early last year, but still haven't let everyone back. And as I've uploaded to Rumble, as you'll be able to see, this is nearly 50,000 views in a day because I got featured on the Rumble Editors selection page. We're going to be hopefully simultaneously streaming to YouTube and Rumble going forward. Thank you to the chaps behind the scenes at Rumble who are helping me set that up. Always nice to have contingencies in the Soviet states of Britain, isn't it? Anyway, let's get into the main substance. So this is the Gorton and Denton by-election. If you don't know where Gorton and Denton is, because you don't live in Manchester, like me, there's a helpful map on the parliamentary website. It's just outside of central Manchester. If you zoom and scroll, you'll be able to see it sits just outside Manchester city centre, just above Stockport, and they're not far from Oldham. So this is bordering on grooming gang territory. So, as you can imagine, concerns about immigration, the Pakistani grooming gang scandal, migrant crime, English identity, are very salient among the white working class voters in this area. Thank you to the chap that just joined YouTube membership, by the way. I'm trying to do early release videos for members as much as possible, just to reward you guys, but some people join just for the sake of supporting me, which I appreciate. Anyway, so this area is prime reform territory. Former, now disillusioned Labour voters who want to flip to a genuine alternative to the Uniparty, who they feel have betrayed them. They showed up for Brexit, they showed up for Boris, they didn't show up for Starmer because they knew what he was made of, and now they're eligible to vote for reform. But voter enthusiasm will dip if reform is perceived as Tories 2.0. Anyway, so the candidates listed include Angeliki Stogia for Labour, good British name, Matt Goodwin for Reform, Hannah Spence for the Green Party, Charlotte Cadham for the Conservatives, me neither, and then various other parties. Now you can see here that there is a Libertarian Party candidate. I'm sure they'll get about as far as the Libertarian Party in the US does. There's the Monster Raving Loony Party, Sir Oinkalot. He's got my vote. There's a Communist candidate, who at this point could have joined a number of these parties, frankly. And there is an Advance candidate. So we will be getting into the splitting of the right very shortly. And Lander, who is in chat, who has been deputized as a mod, so if you say anything that could get the stream taken down or thrown in prison, the very sensible British Lander will make sure you're incapable of doing that. But he put out a video about 2 days ago now, which you should go and watch. Always support the work of your mutuals. And he did say to those that are complaining about Advance standing a candidate against reform, what did you expect? They're a political party, and they have formed largely out of the base that has grown discontented with reform because of how local branches were treated by Zia Yusuf, how Zia Yusuf reported Rupert Lowe to the police, and the sudden prominence of former Tories and a large number of Muslim spokespeople within reform, which was meant to be a genuine, authentic, anti-uniparty alternative representing the native, dispossessed British people. So, you shouldn't be shocked that they field a candidate. The question is not whether or not they should have fielded a candidate, or whether or not they were expected to field a candidate. The question now is, which candidate is the most prudent for us to support? Us being the broader British right in rhetorical terms, acting as an amplifier for that candidacy. Someone asked in the chat, where is UKIP? I believe Nick Tenconi, who is the leader of UKIP, said that UKIP would not be standing a candidate in this election, but will be standing candidates at the national level in 2029. So that's the announcement that has been made. Anyway, so there's also one to be on your radar. Nothing's been announced yet. But a Labour MP called Dan Norris, I mean, Labour had already won over the nonce vote, so tracks, was arrested on suspicion of sexual assault, voyeurism, and upskirting, among other offences that will get me demonetised on YouTube if I mention. Dan's constituency is Jacob Rees-Mogg's old constituency. So that is going to be another by-election coming up very soon, probably before the May local elections, and that's one to watch. And the reason I mention it is because, one, the Gorton and Denton by-election will have an impact on which candidate stood for reform, and whether or not the reform ascendancy to government before or on 2029 seems inevitable anymore. And two, whether or not Jacob Rees-Mogg stands as a reform candidate. Because just from chatter, well-sourced chatter, Jacob Rees-Mogg is personally torn as to whether or not to stand as a Conservative or join reform, because he has been acting as an attempted broker for a Tory reform electoral pact on his old GB News show and now on his new YouTube channel. And Mogg is very annoyed about the treatment of Suella, the defections of his friends and allies over to reform. He maintains a close friendship with many of the people within reform. But he is still a sentimental Conservative. And so, well, the moment to make a decision has fast approached, given this is his old constituency. He stands a chance at winning it back, but he probably stands a better chance running on a reform ticket rather than under Kemi's Conservative. So, one to watch. Anyway, so the candidates in Gorton and Denton. Let's go down the list. This is Labour's candidate. Now, this woman is obviously a patsy. This woman has been put up after Andy Burnham was blocked from running. The original candidate who withdrew, whose name I can't remember, the original MP, withdrew because a bunch of his text got leaked and he was joking about constituents he didn't like dying. Not a good look. So Labour aren't going to be able to win this. Totally doomed. If you notice, by the way, all of the people standing behind them, I genuinely think it's Lucy Powell and only one or two other people who are English in the Labour lineup. Lucy Powell, by the way, is the same Lucy Powell who said the grooming gangs are a little trumpet and a dog whistle that Tim Montgomery, former Conservative, now Reform, was blowing on the BBC. So, dismisses the worst child abuse scandal in British history out of hand as a racist dog whistle. So this is the woman that Labour thought they were going to deploy. They're either utterly delusional or just okay with winning the seat. And they know that Powell's star is sinking and therefore happy to attach her to this campaign. But this candidate apparently says she's a proud Mancunian. Just listen to the dulcet tones, the regional accent that rings throughout her candidacy. And
Absolutely thrilled and excited, and I want to thank everyone who came to the hustings. I am a proud Mancunian woman. I have walked the streets of this constituency. This is about Manchester. Manchester is a city united. We are rejecting division. I am so looking forward to going out on the doorstep and winning this for Labour. Yeah!
Right, so they just plucked her straight out of Athens and have parachuted her into Gorton and Denton. Fantastic. Yeah, she's not going to win. So, good. Labour, completely off the table. Andy Burnham wasn't allowed to run to try and salvage Keir Starmer's ailing premiership, at least to shamble on until the May elections. Though every portent from the gods, Greek, I suppose ironic, seems to be giving out the signal that Starmer's days are dwindling in number. I mean, just look at the revelations from the Epstein files and how his choice for US Ambassador Peter Mandelson, which he was briefed against doing by the British intelligence agencies, those still inside them that have a modicum of sense, I suppose. Turns out he was leaking state secrets about Gordon Brown, about trying to pressure the British government into reneging on bankers' bonus caps by using Jeffrey Epstein and international finance to change British government policy. He's now resigned from the House of Lords, I believe. He should be in prison. Anyway, there's nothing that can recover the fact that Starmer, personally, and his government are the most hated on record. Labour aren't going to win this area. Okay, what about the Tories? No. No. Sorry, there's no more commentary I can add. She might be a nice woman. No. Former police officer Charlotte Cadden. So the exact kind of face you'd expect knocking on your door when you send a hurty tweet. Okay, she's not going to win. Roz from Monsters Inc., isn't it? Anyway, the Greens have picked Hannah Spencer, who... Okay. I don't wish to be mean, but is pretty transparently trying to run as an authentic local working class candidate when she's not actually that hard up. Like, for example, she keeps saying that she's a plumber. She's actually a clean energy technician. So not your average Sparky, not being funny. 34, and she says she thanks party members for her nomination, and she says, where was it? Reform have chosen a candidate that will divide our community. He doesn't even think many of the people who live and work here are even British. We'll get to that in a moment. I will bring the people of Gorton and Denton together. She added, this is a crucial by-election. The choice is clear. Green v Reform, Hope v Hate. There's that mimetic phrase coming up again. Don't worry, Hope Not Hate will feature pretty heavily in this broadcast. So, who's Reform's candidate? Matt Goodwin. Now, this makes me rather happy, for a few reasons. Because, one, Matt is one of the few people within Reform who has still maintained a line of open dialogue with me, even despite the party banning me from their events. It's because I've known Matt for a few years. And I last saw him at December at the Trigonometry Christmas party. Had a good old chinwag and a chat. He didn't tell me he was doing this, but there you go. And The benefit to having Matt in Reform is that he actually represents the authentic right-wing flank of the party, and he's not contaminated by years of Conservative government failure, unlike most of their recent defections and members. I think Matt's actually one of the few members of Reform who was never a Tory. So, Matt worked for previous governments. He's an academic. But he's always been... He's never had a Thatcherite economic bent, and he's been on a political journey. And he's never been a Conservative councillor or candidate or mayor or MP. And the beneficial thing about Matt is that, let's, for sake of argument here, take his Damascene conversion as given. We'll be going through the reasons that people are sceptical. I'll be still manning the case, so don't worry, chat. I'm not strategically overlooking the fact that he used to write policy papers about sabotaging the right. We're going to go through it in detail. But let's say that his conversion is very sincere. That means he knows the enemy inside and out, and he knows the institutions inside and out. For example, prevent and counter terror at the Home Office. He knows what Hope Not Hate have been up to. And therefore, if the previous leaks about Reform's shadow cabinet are true, and Zia Yusuf, Mohammed Ziyad Yusuf, would be given the Home Office brief, so we would get, under Reform, another Muslim Home Secretary, wouldn't it be better instead to have Matt Goodwin MP as the shadow Home Secretary for Reform? Because by being an MP, he would immediately have more bargaining power than Zia Yusuf, right? Just a suggestion going forward. And also the fact that Matt still retains good relations with figures who the softer edge of Reform refuse to liaise with means that he's actually interested in the ideas, and he pays attention to our sphere. So it would be very useful to have an MP who keeps a listening ear open to the concerns of young people, the online right, the actual national populist base of Reform, rather than the donors or courting Tory defections. I think that's just a sensible case for doing so. And the reason this should be considered is because if we look at the Gorton and Denton likely result from electoral calculus, sort of aggregator of the polls at the moment, Reform have a 61% chance of winning. Now, it's quite interesting because Gorton and Denton has a 30% Muslim demographic in the seat. And so the fact that the Greens didn't choose a Muslim candidate, the fact that Labour didn't choose a Muslim candidate, wild. Absolutely wild. If they would have picked that, it would have been a much closer race. They could have galvanised it, but instead, it looks like Reform might be able to consolidate the dispossessed, pissed off, white working class vote and translate it into a Matt Goodwin victory. That's very good, okay? I think that's very good. We're going to go through why people might not think so, but also, as well, judge a man by his enemies and his repeated statements, and Matt has been one of the hardest line on immigration and demographics over the last few years, and the people throwing a fit about him being a candidate and likely winning should fill us with glee a little bit. For example, Nick Lowles, who is treating Matt like a class traitor. And there's a reason, yes, Matt has worked with Hope Not Hate before. About 10 to 15 years ago. Nick Lowles is saying we will be going all in to stop Matt Goodwin getting elected in the Gorton and Denton by-election. Nick, I don't think they need your help. I think Labour have the nonce vote on lock. Just for clarification, because I don't live in a free country, I'll explain that joke. Hope Not Hate recently, it turns out they employed a convicted paedophile to represent them during the parliamentary legislation drafting sessions for the Online Safety Act. You know, ostensibly to protect kids online. So, Nick Lowles, you know how there are some endorsements that you don't want? I think Nick Lowles is probably one of them at this point. So Labour have been descending on Matt because Tommy Robinson said vote for Matt. I've just seen Robinson's reply. Pretty much everyone has said, okay, one, so what? He can support who he likes. Two, Tommy Robinson is more popular than the Labour Party at this point in the country. I mean, how many men can Keir Starmer raise outside Parliament? Probably a spattering of spads. And that number is diminished by, what is it, like 5 Ukrainian rent boys now? Anyway, but Tommy Robinson can get a few 100,000 people out in the streets for the Unite the Kingdom rally. Again, no matter any of your personal objections to Tommy Robinson's style of politics, if you think he's too soft, it cannot be denied. Robinson is very popular with a large portion of the British public. And so, actually, Labour are drawing attention to this in an area that is affected by mass Muslim migration, surrounded by areas in which the grooming gangs have notoriously operated. It's basically a badge of endorsement for Matt Goodwin. But Labour have been hammering on this. Now, this is quite ironic, though, because, was it 10 years ago? Matt and Robinson were on the BBC's Any Questions, arguing with one another. Let's play this clip. It's almost quaint and nostalgic.
And we're here talking about the far right. Can someone define far right to me, please?
The old politics.
Matt, can you define
Matt,
far right?
Matt's one of the experts on that very thing.
Far right, yeah.
There are two key things that far-right groups share. Okay, firstly, they reject or they undermine what representative liberal democracy is all about. Now, a liberal representative democracy accepts that a plurality of views is legitimate. We should support those views. We should allow those views. Okay, and I think what many people would feel is that your organisation and the way in which you campaign is automatically discounting the views of Muslims and the rights of Muslims to hold those views. But secondly, what far-right groups share, I mean, I'm sure you would say you're not the same organisation as, say, I don't know, the American Nazi Party, right? Because there's a lot of variation within those parties. Hold on.
Yeah.
But what they also share, ultimately, is a rejection of human equality.
Now, bear in mind, chat, again, this is 10-ish years ago. These are not terms that Matt Goodwin talks in now. Matt Goodwin is not in favour of the blank slate. He is pretty opposed to Islam. And he is a hardliner on drawing distinctions between native Brits, on the lines of ancestry, and the broader legally British tax-paying public, versus immigrants who aren't wanted, won't assimilate, weren't invited, and leech off the taxpayer and commit crimes. So, modern Matt Goodwin is not a champion of colourblind, culture-blind human equality. So, anyway, just thought I'd pause there.
And I would guess that many people who are watching the show would feel that your organisation is no longer talking about militant Islam.
Okay.
You're just talking about Muslims.
Okay, well, you'd say
I'll bring
far
Jamie
right.
and Abra in a
You'd say
second.
far right. I say we've got a Sikh division,
I don't have to be a Jew.
a Jewish division, a Hindu division, and excuse me, sorry, and Matthew's an expert on the far right, yeah. Matthew, you're from Kettering, 98% Christian. You was brought up in Kettering.
No, I wasn't.
Where was you brought up?
Chiswell Green.
Chiswell Green. Well, what's the population of Muslims there? It's non-existent. There's
I live in
none.
Manchester. I'm
you live in
more
Manchester now.
than familiar with
What
that.
I'm saying is, where you've been brought up, yeah, there's been no Muslims, there's been no immigration. Where I've been brought up, when your children go to a school where other children at that school's fathers are teaching them hatred due to their Islamic extremist views, then you can be an expert. Because all these experts which are doing all these studies and reading all these books, they're out of touch with reality.
Jamie Bartlett, are you out of touch?
In all fairness, young Robinson was quite persuasive. I mean, he's not saying anything different than I say now. He's actually far softer than I was. I mean, if I had a right-wing protest movement, I wouldn't be forming Sikh and Hindu divisions, but there you go. So, because Robinson had said, vote for Matt, Labour have now started a campaign with this grotesque Aardman animation creature, again, Lucy Powell, complaining about Robinson supporting Matt. Again, the de facto endorsement.
So the cat is out of the bag. Tommy Robinson, the far-right activist and former head of EDL, is backing Reform's candidate in the Gorton and Denton by-election. Tommy Robinson's views have got no place here in Manchester, and I know that people round here will be as horrified as I am to hear that he's backing Matt Goodwin. So if Matt wants people to know that he doesn't share Tommy Robinson's views, then he must come out immediately and denounce him and reject his support. Otherwise, he'll leave people with no alternative but to draw the conclusion that he shares them.
She's like a character from Invasion of the Body Snatchers. It's like some sort of like a Lovecraftian horror that has replaced human beings, but had these... She's like the mum from Coraline. Just these soulless eyes, a doll's eyes. Anyway, so Labour have continued to hound Matt. As Anna Turley has said, I've written to you demanding a full condemnation of Tommy Robinson. Matt has always had a good line on Robinson. And this is the line that I think should be struck. Because Robinson is used as a bogeyman to get you to no longer focus on the problems that the establishment have caused. And those problems have caused Tommy Robinson. And so, Matt made the following point before. The blunt reality is Tommy Robinson would not be a significant figure were it not for the continued failure of the media and political class to call out and address the problem of Pakistani Muslim grooming gangs. It's an unpopular view, but it's true. No notes, no corrections needed. Tommy would still be an anonymous Luton fan, renovating houses with his family, and probably doing pretty well for himself, and not involved at all in street-level activism, but might have a couple of minor charges for a few scraps when his team's down 3-0. He wouldn't be an internationally notorious political activist. And someone in the chat said, yeah, Tommy says that himself. He did. He said that on Dan Wootton. You wouldn't know the name Tommy Robinson if not for Muslim migration. I think that migration on the whole, specifically from the third world, has been a major problem. But the issue that he focuses on, if it didn't exist, Tommy Robinson, the political folk hero, wouldn't exist. Matt is right. So he hasn't felt the need to denounce them. He has cleverly, rhetorically repositioned the debate away from ritualistic denunciation of an Emmanuel Goldstein-style hate figure and refocused fire back on the establishment that produced these problems, that covered up the crimes for political correctness, that brought the immigrants here in the first place. This is why Matt is very effective. Who isn't effective is Danny Kruger. So today, Danny Kruger went on the BBC, and they asked Danny Kruger, do you denounce Tommy Robinson? And Danny Kruger, the man who responded to The Spectator running a piece about Bonnie Blue, you know, infamous prostitute Bonnie Blue, who is single-handedly responsible for presenting British women on the global stage as whores willing to sleep with as many men from the third world as possible. When she wrote in The Spectator that she supports reform, he joked and said, we're not in the business of telling people not to support us. But Tommy Robinson is apparently a step too far and deserves denunciation. In favour, by the way, of inclusive civic nationalism. Have a listen.
Danny, I just want to ask you, because there is a by-election coming up in Greater Manchester, in Gorton and Denton, and your candidate, Matthew Goodwin, who's the candidate for Reform, he's been endorsed by the far-right activist Tommy Robinson. I mean, are you comfortable with that?
No, not at all. No, we don't want his support, and it's up to him who he chooses to endorse. But, you know, people are free to do that. We had Bonnie Blue endorsing us too. We're not going to make a particular welcome to that. People will endorse us if they want to, but no, we absolutely stand against what Tommy Robinson stands for. We have a vision of a civic nationalism, of patriotism for this country, no matter where you come from, and that message is resonating across the country. All people from all different walks of life and backgrounds are supporting us. We don't want Tommy Robinson.
But do you think you should be rejecting that? Should Matt Goodwin be rejecting that?
I think he's done
more
so
clearly.
Well, I think we've done so. I think well, Nigel Farage has very clearly, and over many years, said that we don't want the support of the far right.
No, but as the candidate, Matt Goodwin has.
Well, I presume so.
Well,
I mean, that's the part.
Never engage in ritualistic denunciations on behalf of your enemies who would rather see you fail, either by meeting their standards or alienating your own electorate. Again, one does not have to think that it is prudent for Reform to throw their arms around Tommy Robinson, to recognise that it is not prudent for Reform to sit there and participate in turning Robinson into a hate figure when many in their own base have sympathies with Robinson. And it's also not wise to say, we are a value pluralist liberal civic nationalist party who believes that literally anyone from anywhere can become as British as you and me. Because that's not what Reform voters believe. I mean, see my previous video on why civic nationalists are losing the immigration debate for the breakdown, but the majority of Reform voters and supporters believe that Britain is a nation comprised of ethnic peoples, not bland values that can be recited like a Scout's pledge, and that they would prefer if Britain, the British Isles, was more ethnically homogeneous and culturally coherent. So, no, the majority of Reform supporters are not actually happy about you constantly courting the Muslim vote or trying to be this sort of inclusive 2010 David Cameron, we're a propositional nation party. Actually, they are a lot more concerned about ethnicity and identity than even Tommy Robinson is. Because Tommy Robinson says that people who are not ethnically indigenous can themselves be English, Welsh, Scottish, and Irish, at least in his eyes, because he's friends with them. Now, Robinson is actually, in that regard, inconsistently perhaps, to the left of someone like Suella Braverman on the question of English ethnic identity and the exclusivity of it. So Danny Kruger sitting there saying, as he did at the Now in England conference, that you can, learn to be English, anyone can identify as being English, is actually the attack line that like one of the Labour MPs has made against Matt Goodwin. Because he's then saying, by my standard of being even more inclusive, of being even more celebratory of Britain's migrant communities who, settled us the wilderness that we were in 1948 thanks to the Windrush and subsequent Commonwealth migration waves, well, because I am actually even more inclusive than you, I am therefore more British than you. And that makes Matt Goodwin not very British. So that standard, Danny, allows your enemies to say that you are inauthentically patriotic by the values that you say that you share with them. And also the other problem is, okay, let's say that we are a purely civic, values-based, propositional community. That we believe that anyone can live here as long as they sign up to our values. And don't get me wrong, it's a nice vision to have. Because I think we don't actually really want to be forced to think in groupish terms. We like to take people as we meet them, and we would hope that basically everyone thinks like us. And it's upon those safe demographic givens that older people, like Danny, or people who live in 99% white English constituencies, like Devises, Danny's, is the kind of thing they take for granted. But anyway, let's say that everyone really does think exactly the same. And everyone can be just as patriotic as long as they sign up to those pledge of British values. Okay, Danny, what happens when they don't? What happens when an immigrant comes in and says, yes, I'm patriotic, I'm British, bro, I love the Bulldogs and Churchill and tea and biscuits, and the next day goes, actually, you know what, I'm an anti-white revolutionary, I like Bob Dylan. Let's ethnically cleanse people from the English countryside because white people scare me, as one chap said on GB News, I think it was yesterday. What happens then? Is there any enforcement for them not subscribing to those values? Are you proposing that we strip immigrants of their citizenship if they fail your civic values test? Or are there no consequences for having all of these people enter our country and hate us? Because if there is no enforcement of the proposition, of the values, then it's fucking pointless. So, intellectually incoherent, unfortunately not the line that Matt Goodwin takes, but I just wanted to linger on that for a moment because it's not sensible for Reform to continue to attack Tommy Robinson and therefore their base by proxy on behalf of the BBC. So, Robinson endorsed Matt, and this was before Advance UK, Ben Habib's party, of which Tommy Robinson is a member, decided to stand their own candidate, and that's Nick Buckley. Now, Nick Buckley lives in Manchester. I believe lives in Gorton and Denton, has been brought up there. And I've also known Nick. I haven't spoken to him for a couple of years, but he used to come on Lotus Eaters from time to time, presented a few segments with him. He's a nice chap. Let's speak realistically about this. I don't want to discourage anyone from trying to start a political movement based on conviction. I don't want to discourage anyone trying to start a political movement that occupies the vacant space to Reform's right and either drags them rightward to take stances which are popular with the majority of the public and also necessary to fix the country, like denaturalizing and deporting people. But, and this is feedback I will freely give, can we do better than just a bit shit? I don't want to be a dick. Nick is a very nice man. Everyone involved in Advance, very nice. They're trying to will the project into being. But I'm sorry, a national political party can't be using AI for its promotional videos. I don't know why a right-wing party is using words like equality and democracy. It's just not polished. It's just not there yet. Now, is Reform any good? Far too beholden to its international donor class. Full of former Tories. Still has Zia Youssef in a prominent position. Layla Cunningham is an obvious grifter who's probably going to lose the London mayoral race. All of these things can be true at the same time as Advance not being quite up to snuff yet, despite people's best efforts. And I say all this, I've been invited to this thing on Saturday that they're doing. They're launching some policies and having some speakers. I'm going in my capacity as a person in the space, and if you go to these events, you actually get a better feel for what's going on, sort of shifting political plate tectonics. You get to talk to people, you come away with some more stories. It's going to provide some value to you people, I hope. But I think it was premature to stand a candidate here. It's to be expected of a national political party, of course, but I think it was premature because Advance just aren't really there yet. They're standing a candidate without any policies, for example. Like, they announced Nick's candidacy before they've got a national policy platform. So, what Advance features as, and I think people that are trying to make Advance happen, even in this chat as I'm streaming, will agree with me, what Advance features as is basically a spoiler vote for Reform. And let's look at another by-election that Reform won, and this was earlier last year, in Runcorn and Helsby, for why this might actually succeed. So, remember Sarah Pochin won this seat, and people were very sceptical of Sarah Pochin, me included. I was one of the people sharing her career lowlights, where she was celebrating Afghan and Syrian refugees coming into her constituency while she was a mayor. She hosted some sort of drag queen story hour pride event. Again, former Tory. But ever since she's got in, she's actually been pretty based. Like saying that she's sick to death of artificial rates of interracial couples in adverts and not backing down, saying she wants to ban the burqa. Still maintaining a friendship with Rupert Lowe. She's been a solid MP, actually. Sarah Pochin, if you notice, won this constituency by 6 votes. 6. Now, she would have been in a much more secure position had 2 months before Zia Youssef not called the police on Rupert Lowe. Because Catherine Blakelock, the former founder of the Brexit Party, used to work with Nigel Farage, ran for the English Democrat Party in that seat. And if you notice, she got 95 votes. So she had, no disrespect, no chance ever of winning that seat. But she nearly ruined it for Reform by 6 votes. Reform would have had a comfortable, almost 100-vote lead, if not for Catherine Blakelock, because it's unlikely that those voters would have voted for anyone else if they would have voted. If Reform had not treated Rupert Lowe so poorly, Catherine Blakelock would not have run in the first place. If Reform had not treated Ben Habib and various members of their local branches so poorly, Advance UK would not exist. It would not now be running a candidate against Matt Goodwin. So, there is a very real risk when people say about splitting the right-wing vote, and then saying, of course, well, the Conservatives aren't right-wing. True. Reform aren't right-wing. Depends on the person. So, I'm going to vote on principle for an actual right-wing party. Okay, but Advance doesn't have any policy yet. You might like the people involved, but it doesn't have any policy. There is a very real chance here of actually spreading the right-wing vote. Shaving some votes off of Matt Goodwin's total. If the Muslim demographic voting bloc is galvanised sufficiently in Gorton and Denton, it could supersede Reform. And they need every vote they can get, so those that are going to Advance could cost Matt Goodwin the seat. And I think, frankly, between the two men, having known them, if my opinion therefore counts for much, Matt's going to be the better MP. And the reason is he has a degree of ruthlessness that is required for this moment. He is far more polished communicator. He knows things like the Home Office inside and out. He has a mastery of the stats. He also has a much more polished presentation in terms of his team, his graphics, and that matters in the age of social media politics. And if, presuming Reform is going to win an election, and we'll discuss whether or not that is guaranteed later, presuming Reform are going to be the next party of government, in the interim years between now and winning in 2029 and forming a government, who do you want to have at the head table to have a disproportionate amount of bargaining power to steer the party towards our preferred direction? Would you prefer Zia Yusuf or Matt Goodwin? Because if Matt Goodwin loses this by-election, he's probably not going to be given another seat. Realise that. It is beneficial to us to have Matt Goodwin as an MP, even if you're pissed off with reform. And I say this, again, having been banned from reform. So, just something worth considering for everyone who is thinking, in the by-election, of not voting for Matt, and for those who are trying to manufacture hype around Advance prior to them having candidates, while they're still using AI for their promotional graphics, and while, by the way, Ben Habib keeps saying that he doesn't actually want to lead a party, it wasn't his plan after all. If you're going to choose a time to spoil the ballot, essentially, to stop reform from getting in, maybe don't pick it for Matt Goodwin. Would be a... Like, can we just... The left do tactical voting all the time. They are, in this respect, rather smart. Despite your frustrations with reform, put your tactical voting caps on, gents, and be a bit more strategic for this one. So, that's the electoral case for voting for Matt. What about the case for Matt's personal principles? And addressing the doubts about Matt's sincerity. How his Damascene conversion could have been pulled off. So there's this rather mendacious piece in the Times from Josh Glancy, and remember, if the Times is attacking someone, they're on our side. So, Glancy has written in here, there's a popular theory that seeks to explain Matt Goodwin's journey from consensual centrist academic to right-wing populist firebrand. And the theory is summed up by missing a dinner invitation. Apparently, the dinner took place in London in October 2023. Goodwin had just taken on former Times columnist David Aronovich, insufferable man, at a debate about elitism moderated by the former Guardian editor Alan Rusbridger. And Rusbridger has written about this in Prospect magazine in an article we'll be getting round to in a bit. Once proceedings concluded, the two venerable journalistic poobahs decamped for a bowl of pasta, but Goodwin's invitation was lost in the post. He was miffed and sent a follow-up email to Rusbridger, wondering why he'd been snubbed. Rusbridger then mocked him in the Evening Standard diary column. Sneering elites, thwarted ambition, yearning for acclaim, exclusion from the in-crowd. These, so the theory goes, are the engines of Goodwin's resentment and have driven him from being a successful academic, professor of politics at University of Kent, my old alumni, to anti-woke crusader, radical blogger, he's the largest Substack in the country, GB News presenter, and now Nigel Farage's pick as the Reform candidate for the seminal by-election of Gorton and Denton. Now, Matt actually responds in here. What does Goodwin make of this theory? How does he explain his political journey? He describes his childhood in St Albans as being part of a single-parent working-class family, where money was always a problem. His parents split up when he was very young. His father, Neil, ended up in Didsbury, so he tells his entire story. And then there's the theory part. Where was it? I think it's towards the end. I'm just going to search that chat. It says, wow, the arrogance of making that argument. Yes, I really desperately wanted to be a professor at an Oxford college in a backwater, having zero influence over anything. The last thing I want to be is part of a class that has sold the country down the river and screwed over a forgotten majority just to make themselves feel good. Okay, well, that's pretty decisive. It's also a theory you can only believe. You haven't read a lot of Matt's published work, because that dinner was in 2023, right? So in 2018, Matt wrote this book with Roger Eatwell, National Populism, The Revolt Against Liberal Democracy, basically making the intellectual case for why national populism is a legitimate philosophy, being that they are fed up with the elites described in Christopher Lash's Revolt of the Elites in the 90s. That's a book that Matt actually recommended to me personally, and I found very influential. And why the dispossessed native populations of Europe and Britain were right to be concerned about mass migration, were right to vote for Brexit, and are right to be frustrated that it wasn't delivered. And then he wrote one in 2021, Values, Voice and Virtue, which I actually interviewed him about on the Lotus Caesars in 2022, again, making the case for a new political realignment involving the Red Wall, people who are not natural economic Thatcherites, but who wanted Brexit and liberation from the European Union because of the false promises of globalization, of the failures of neoliberalism as championed by Blair and Cameron, and eventually Boris, and their core concern being immigration on cultural and demographic rather than economic grounds. And all of that is presented throughout those books as legitimate, warrants political representation, and warrants action being taken. He's not just doing the Fraser Nelson thing of telling people what they want to hear so that you can then do the opposite. So he has a consistent career of this. So just saying that he's upset because he didn't get a dinner party from a former Times and Guardian columnist, sorry, it's just bollocks. And at the bottom of the article, he actually said, most of these people criticising me are nerds. The last thing I want to be is at some dinner party table with Nick Robinson and Mary Beard. I'd rather shoot myself in the head. Based patriot. So then you've got Ros Bridger writing in Prospect magazine a rather resentful article summing up Matt's new opinions and going through yet again the story about him being snubbed from the dinner party. And he says, who are these new elites? They are anywheres, David Goodhart's formulation, the international mobile business class who feel more at home in an airport lounge than in their own countries, who feel more at home at Davos, Brussels and Berlin than in provincial Britain, as he puts. They are highly educated professionals with an unwavering commitment to radical social liberalism, hyperglobalization and woke ideology. They hold luxury beliefs and believe in authoritarian progressivism. Again, couldn't put it better myself. Accurate summation of Matt's opinions there, the class against which we are rebelling. The vehicle that Matt sees reform as being a battering ram against whose castle doors. If that sentence made sense. Like, Matt... Oh, should I tell this story? I might get in trouble. Right, okay, so I was at the Trump inauguration party, and this was where Farage spoke, and it was the night before the inauguration. And it was me and Steve Edgington, just sort of standing around being antisocial, making best use of the buffet, like true spurgs. And Matt walks over and taps us on the shoulder, liking us both very much, and he just says, guys, I think we need to, put our differences aside and recognize that reform is the vehicle. We should probably, we should get behind it, no matter how discontented you are with Farage. At that point, both Steve and I had been vocal about our disappointment that Farage wasn't supporting mass deportations. He says, if you get on board, if you get involved, you probably get what you want. And Liz Truss was nearby. famous for her acrimonious interview with Steve Edgington and her rather positive one with me. And she just turned to Matt, looked at Steve and said, I'd rather tie cement to his legs than throw him in the Potomac. So I don't think you're going to get that coalition coming anywhere near soon. But look, Matt has always privately and publicly supported reform and actually, encouraged me along. So he has been consistent. And so he sees reform as the best chance to put a brick through the elite's window, metaphorically speaking, of course. Trump's right, says Goodwin. Talking of civilization, we are on the verge of demographic rupture. He stood shoulder to shoulder with Donald Trump when the latter recently observed certain places in Europe are not even recognisable. Friends come back and say, I don't recognise it, not in a positive way. In some, Matt's worried there are too many Muslims in Britain. He's alarmed by research that shows about 17% of the UK population could be Muslim by 2050. Muslims are bluntly outbreeding native British people, and in future we need to put British children and families at the very centre of our aspirations and priorities. Who is British? Well, in Goodwin's mind, the new elites believe in a thin version of citizenship, like Danny Kruger, whereas he himself prefers a thicker version based on an ethno-traditional idea of shared history and ancestry. It takes more than a piece of paper to make somebody British, he says defiantly. Okay, but that's just what we all think. That's what all of us think, right? Sorry, but you can't get a slip of paper between my opinions and Matt Goodwin's. I hope this isn't one of those moments where this is an endorsement he doesn't want. I'm trying to make your job easy, Matt, I promise. But this is just sensible. This is backed up by a plethora of philosophy and research. This is the majority opinion of not just reforms voters, but of people in the country. And this is just what I would say on a live stream. And Matt is the candidate for Gorton and Denton. He has received Nigel Farage's support. Farage is out there campaigning with him. This is all very positive. And I'm sorry, but I don't see any other offerings that are actually more robust and authentically nationally patriotic, in Matt's terms, than Matt himself. So, counter-signalling and running against him is just counterintuitive to the broader right-wing coalition. And the fact that they're seething about this, collectively in the Times and Prospect and the Guardian, etc., should give you pause for thought and maybe reconsider whether or not he's worth supporting. Because this chap here, who still thinks that he's responsible for Matt's conversion for not buying him a bowl of pasta, says, "This stuff has been around in one form or another for years. The Conservative MP Enoch Powell had a similar preoccupation with immigration and identity and is best remembered for his Rivers of Blood speech, in which, like Goodwin, nearly 60 years later, he warned mass migration would lead to social conflict." Well, I'm so glad Powell's prediction hasn't panned out. The difference is that Powell's most incendiary speech cost him his job, sacked from the shadow cabinet by Ted Heath, traitor, whereas Goodwin has been selected by Reform to contest the forthcoming by-election in Gorton and Denton. They think that Matt Goodwin is Enoch Powell. His rhetoric sounds exactly like mine. He has, if we are to believe this version of events, a personal grudge against the elite class that insulted him and treated him like a turd. And he knows the ins and outs of having worked with Hope Not Hate and the kind of grotesque people that orbit that anti-fascist, scaremongering industrial complex. And so therefore has a reason to take them on. All of this is just an endorsement, I think. All of this is looking positive for us. On the prospects of his victory, by the way, this guy postulates, there are constituencies with a higher proportion of Muslim voters than Gorton and Denton, but not many. The Henry Jackson Society, whose founder is now a member of Reform, by the way, advising them on foreign and counter-terror policy, they have a handy interactive calculator which shows that it ranks 23rd out of 600 voting areas for concentration of Muslims, around 30% in the 2021 census. It's probably gone up since. Around a third of residents were born outside the UK, the average is 17%, 9% are black. It'll be entertaining to see Goodwin engaging with the people he seeks to represent. Will he tell them he's worried about civilizational collapse in areas like Gorton and Denton because there are, to be honest, too many Muslims? Honestly, print it on a leaflet, and you're going to get the majority of the working class vote round there. Will he speculate on how many of his would-be voters are really British, no matter what it says on a spreadsheet? Will he delicately ask them to slow down on the breeding front to allow native Brits to catch up? Are you enjoying this article? Chat. If the voters hadn't watched it already, I can recommend an Al Jazeera programme from last year where he's arguing against Mehdi Hasan, where admittedly Matt did trip up on a bit of data at one point because Hasan was trying to get him flustered, but he was right in saying that foreigners do occupy over 50% of British social housing. Hasan was trying to say, well, they've got British passports, therefore they're British. Never concede the framing. But he told Hasan, the killing of children in Southport in 2024 was obviously about immigration. And then this writer says, even though the killer, Axel Rudikabana, was born in the UK, he is a product of immigration, says Goodwin. Yeah, because his parents never needed to be in the country to raise a killer and hide their son's violent behaviour from the authorities, you absolute hack. Again, Goodwin does not concede the framing. Very good. If you want to have someone making these arguments in Parliament, you could do worse. Just saying. And then, he has been pressed ever since to denounce this belief that just being born in Britain doesn't make you British. Refuses to back down. The Guardian are very upset about this, of course. Goodwin has been criticised for claiming that people from black, Asian or other immigrant backgrounds were not always British, saying it takes more than a piece of paper to make someone British. Patriot. Speaking at an event in Denton, he twice declined to answer, when asked by The Guardian, whether he stood by those views. And then, he refused to answer The Guardian's questions as he posed for photographs alongside Lee Anderson. And then, all he kept doing during the press conference was bringing it back to the grooming gangs, which operate in the neighbouring constituency. So, don't take shit from lefty journalists who hate you. Don't retreat from what the majority of the public and your own voters believe. Always bring the issue back to how the ruling class have failed us. Matt knows the playbook, and he's running it well. And so, because those lines of attack have failed, instead, a Labour MP who I can only imagine is farming Isat, and by the fact that we've now pointed it out, he's just lost all his Isat, has decided to jump the proverbial shark in the Ganges and declare that Matt Goodwin himself isn't British. Just, we'll watch.
The thing about Matt Goodwin is he's not very British.
Thanks, Dr. Jeevan Sander. I'm glad that you get to determine who is and isn't British. You're an Indian man. That's fine. That's fine. I've known plenty of nice Indian people, actually. You don't get to tell me who is and isn't British. My identity is not your cosplay. It's not a philosophy that you can rote learn. It is an ancestry. It is a collection of families in a place over time whose culture has been passed down across generations. And it is nothing like the various cultures practiced in India. And so I'm sorry, but you don't get to tell me who is and isn't British. And nobody is buying this, I'm afraid.
The same actually goes to Tommy Robinson, who's just endorsed him. Matt thinks you can't really be British unless you're 1, white, and 2, you have the right great-grandparents. Now, Goodwin's definition means that Winston Churchill isn't really British, and I don't think Churchill would like that very much.
What? What? Sorry, no, Churchill has native ancestry. And by your own standard, which you say that Matt says, which he hasn't said, Churchill was white. Like, he actually wanted to run, I think it was in 1952, when he was trying to become Prime Minister again, on a Keep Britain White slogan. So, by your standard, Jeevan, you don't think Churchill was British either. Because he was exclusionary of non-white people. Okay, but yeah, again, this isn't about consistency. This is just about, 1, this man personally farming is at, but 2, desperate attacks to try and stop Matt Goodwin from winning in a constituency that is bordered by the grooming gang scandal, by using accusations of racism to galvanise a resentful foreign population to vote as an ethnic bloc against the party, or at least the candidate, that is representing the left-behind white working class majority. So this is just basically ethnic warfare, while subversively using the categories, the civic categories, of who is and isn't British according to modern Blairite values as cover. And this is why the likes of Danny Kruger shouldn't be conceding to this framing, because it allows guys like this to do this.
But it's about a lot more than that. Goodwin doesn't get our British values, our history, our culture. Britain is and has always been made up of different communities.
Yeah, the English, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish, and from about 1650-something, the Jews that came back. That's about it. Like, this guy and his family have not been here for very long. He says that they came over after the Second World War. And so we've had more immigration since 1997 than between 1066 and the Second World War. And by the way, the Norman Conquest was pretty disruptive as it is, because even though they were French Catholics, and they left less than a 5% genetic imprint on the population of the time, by, I think it was like 1920 when they surveyed it, it was still a complete... Like, it was such a radical shock to the Anglo-Saxons at the time to have their entire ruling class and culture, their identity, their language, and their heritage replaced. The daughters of Anglo-Saxon noblewomen forcibly married off to Normans. Their architecture scrubbed. Their modes of government abolished. It was such a seismic shock that the model of Norman rule and the Anglo-Saxons living beneath the yoke of Norman rule is still a powerful literary device in English culture today. There are obviously parallels to be drawn between the current state, mass migration, and that. And so, the idea that Britain has always been a nation of immigrants, or has always been a nation of different people, and just different people doesn't mean the indigenous tribes of the British Isles plus a couple of Romans, a handful of Normans and Huguenots and Jews, but actually just means the entire Indian subcontinent. Sorry, again, nobody, pardon the pun, is passing the sniff test here. Like, nobody's buying it.
Different communities that come together. Dozens of different accents. You could say Bath in London and Bath up in Loughborough. When different migrant communities came from across the Irish Sea, from India, from across the world, in fact.
Do you notice that? Oh, when different migrant communities came from across the Irish Sea, from India. Okay, well, I think Ireland might be a little bit closer in culture, in genetics, in geographic proximity than India. But if you notice, he just said, oh, you know, migrants from Ireland, which are exactly the same as migrants from India, the group that I happen to be a part of and representing. Yeah, no, you're not as British as you and me, actually, Jeevan. You are Indian, and your attempt to redefine my identity is very condescending and is rejected. Your British identity card has not been redeemed, I'm afraid.
What was a former empire? Those different communities came together to forge one British nation. We can all cheer on the football team, even if we don't look exactly the same. But Goodwin doesn't get that. And he doesn't understand our historic values either. Of standing together, of treating each other well, of not giving up. All of that was forged from our collective sacrifice during the war.
It's literally post-war boomer liberalism being used as a Trojan horse for blatant ethnic nepotism. Like, you are literally Hitler unless you support millions of Indians coming into your country and redefining your identity. And then, suddenly, for no reason at all, people like Nick Fuentes get on a live stream and mock the Second World War. Oh, I wonder how we diminished the value of Second World War taboos. It couldn't possibly be by not only overusing the words fascist and Nazi, summoning up via seance the spectre of Adolf Hitler repeatedly where it wasn't appropriate. It couldn't just be that, but it could also be the fact that the people doing that are blatant ethno-nationalists, ethnic chauvinists, just not for the country they're currently living in. Anyway.
When people from across what was then the British Empire, people who looked really quite different, came together to fight fascism, not join the other side. But Goodwin doesn't get that. And he doesn't get our culture either.
Game over, boys. He played the Blue Eyes White Dragon. He called him a fascist. It's Goodwin's done for. It's just so tired.
When we take the piss out of each other down the pub, a quiet cup of tea, queuing politely, watching Strictly, all of that.
Okay, I don't drink. Neither do a bunch of Muslims, by the way. Does that make me and the entire Muslim community not British? By your twee criteria. I don't watch Strictly. Does that make Tom Skinner more British than you? I mean, just again. I know it's my fault for trying to intellectually engage with this fallacious argument that is the entire purpose of it is to use the accusations of racism and fascism to galvanise a resentful constituency of foreigners to stop Matt Goodwin from getting elected and to stop us from owning our own country again. Nevertheless, there are people on our own apparent side who have internalised this rhetoric, like Danny Kruger, and it leads to complete sophists and grifters like Jeevan Sandha getting away with this stuff.
Our culture evolves and changes through time. But Matt doesn't get any of this. He thinks Britishness is something that's coded into our genes. Maybe that's why Tommy Robinson's endorsed him. But they're both wrong. They're wrong about this country. And they're just not very British.
By the way, this man's a Sikh, so yeah, not sorry, Tommy, but it's not just Muslims that are the problem in immigration. There's still a lot of ethno-narcissism and ethno-nepotism that enters our politics via the Indian subcontinent from Hindu and Sikh communities as well, and Sandha is an example of that. So he then wrote a complete turd of an article in the New Statesman. Really? New Statesman? Okay, right, give me a second. I'm going to have to get rid of the log in here. Wasn't like this earlier. This is what happens when you don't pull up your links proactively ahead of time, everyone. There we go. I can't believe I went through the extra effort to load this up now. So Matt Goodwin apparently isn't very British, according to Mr. Sandher. He says, at the most basic level, the British people simply disagree with him. Just 6% of white Brits believe you can only be British if you were white. Yes, but that's because it's based on ancestry, not complexion. Like, Ben Habib is English, he's also half Pakistani. Okay, Mr. Sandher. Is Joanna Lumley Indian? Is Rudyard Kipling Indian? Is Jared Taylor Japanese? Like, nobody is going to assert this. You don't hold this standard. So stop trying to unilaterally inflict it upon us, because we notice the double standard. And we notice the double standard just happens to advantage you, and the result of you being advantaged is our dispossession from our own country, so we're not inclined to support that. Thank you very much. He says, Britishness is about so much more than race. It's about ancestry. It is founded in our shared values. I don't share any values with you. So which one of us is British? How our different communities can come together and the intertwined culture that comes of it. Right, so Britain is just this palimpsest, this like blank bit of fabric upon which you stitch other cultures. It's just the container in which you pour other cultures to form this sort of indigestible goop that we keep being told is nutritious for us, but is basically indigestible, right? It's totally intolerable. He says Britain has never looked or sounded the same. Sorry, but when it was 99.9% white British, and the only minorities were Jews, pretty sure the country looked rather similar. I don't think Whitechapel was what the authors of the Magna Carta had in mind, somehow. I think there might have been a radical discontinuity between modern London, which is less than a third English, and Alfred the Great, Guy Fawkes, Oliver Cromwell, Elizabeth I, all of the worlds that these influential figures wanted to bring into being. Again, I know I'm not meant to be engaging with this as if it is good faith, but still, our history is one of different groups coming to Britain and building the nation we see today. Right, so if you're retroactively writing in foreign peoples into British history, then it's not our history. It's only our history, because you are contorting it to encompass people who are not British. So it's the word "our" here does not include me, and it does not include most British people. What it means is the inheritors of the new Labour project post-Tony Blair that have been imported into this country. In the 1840s, hundreds of thousands of migrants arrived across the Irish Sea, bringing religion and accent with them. They revived Roman Catholicism after the Reformation. Over a century later, my own parents came from India to help build modern Britain. Right, okay. So your best example, he didn't go for the Viking invasions and the Norman conquests. Well done. Wasn't as dumb as Freddie Sayers. His most recent example, before his own parents from India, was Ireland, our neighbour. Less than a day's travel by boat. Okay, British is not about homogeneous communities that look or sound the same. Okay, then why do Indians and Pakistanis and Africans live in them then? Why do they live in these little ethnic enclaves, these sequestered, cocooned communities that you call communities, that all look and sound the same, if it's not about that? We belong to different, overlapping communities. I can go to the Gurdwara, my Sikh community, in the morning, and to the pub, my lads' community, in the evening. They aren't the same community, but they overlap through me. So, look, this would be a conciliatory way of framing national identity, solidarity, and belonging, if it weren't encompassed in an article where you are denouncing someone else and denying their heritage and trying to rewrite what it means to be British from the standpoint of an immigrant. From the standpoint, it's basically a guest. If that paragraph, or actually, right, if that sentence, those 2 or 3 sentences, were encased in an article that was making the case from an immigrant standpoint for the possession of the country by the native British majority, and there are a bunch of immigrants who do believe this, right? If they were saying, I feel like I belong in your country because I am situated in a network of friendships, all of whom are patriotic, I am basically an adopted family member, and I would therefore never dream of saying your identity is indistinguishable from my own. Instead, the difference that I recognize between our identities is why we can be friends. If that was the sentiment, I don't think people would object to this chap saying, I feel like I belong in Britain. But it's not. Instead, he's trying to retroactively deprive Matt Goodwin of that identity, and all of us of that identity, because we agree with Matt. But the very fact he's trying to do this, the very fact that he's putting his nose to the political belt sander and destroying his credibility because of it, should, again, be an endorsement of Matt. And then the article just continues to waffle on, basically saying that we fought the Second World War not to engage in petty ethno-nationalism. No, we fought it against the invasion of Poland, which we didn't succeed because we gave it over to the USSR. And then we fought it against German racial supremacism and imperial expansion across the European continent, potentially including Britain. So we didn't fight it against ethno-nationalism because Winston Churchill himself was an ethno-nationalist, by your standard. He probably wouldn't have even used that term because he himself used the term race to mean different European ethnicities and ancestries. He was far more exclusive than just black and white. He was saying specific peoples, nations, are distinct racial groups. He was talking in terms that you, Mr. Jeevan Sandhar, would talk about in terms of Indian diasporas in your own home country, but you don't afford the same consideration to Britain. So the fact that he has got this guy sort of twisting in the wind and turning into Rumpelstiltskin is again, an endorsement. Now, for those of you who haven't read Matt's books, I'll do a brief summary before I get into the case against, and also some of Matt's recent articles. So, within national populism, and this helps trace Matt's journey, he made the following case for why populist political parties are winning elections, why they are morally legitimate, why they are organic representations of public discontent, a frustration with a sclerotic, out-of-touch political elite, and have gained organic support because primarily of the issue of immigration along the lines of cultural and demographic change. So from page 37 to 38, Matt wrote, "The national populist narrative focuses less on the detail of policy and far more on claims about national decline and destruction, which they link not only to immigration and ethnic change, but also what they see as culturally incompatible Muslims and refugees." Pause. That is Reform's entire platform, right? Less of an eye for policy detail, a sort of it will be alright on the night attitude, which I'm with Pete North on this one. I don't think that's going to work. The size of the legislative revolution they have to conduct, it's not good enough to wing it after winning an election. But the idea that we're less focused on policy and more focused on a narrative of national decline, Britain is broken, especially considering other parties are unwilling to admit that, and a focus on immigration. Now, Reform have flip-flopped on immigration, and at least their emphasis on it, ever since winning the election, but they still stand in as the anti-immigration party. So he has presaged Reform by 6 years, and his own membership in Reform as well. Continue. "This is blamed too on an established political class that is in cahoots with capitalists, put profits before people, encouraging endless flows of low-skilled or unskilled workers to satisfy the neoliberal economic system and betray the nation." And this is actually a very sound narrative, because not only is it true, but it eats the lunch of the Green Party, who are just resentful Marxists, who say, of course, international corporations are like parasites on the national economy and ecology, but at the same time then support all the mass migration that those international corporations use to drive down the cost of domestic labour, cheat British workers out of lucrative job opportunities, price up housing, and put the dream of a single income household and family out of reach for indigenous Brits, because they refuse to draw distinctions between British natives and nationals and immigrants and the rest of the world based on the delusion of the blank slate, and at least Matt is doing that. So Matt's angle of not being an unalloyed Thatcherite, being an immigration restrictionist, recognising the salience and importance of identity. I should have brought up that quote, actually, from his recent policy exchange report, which I mentioned in my latest video on why the right isn't recruiting young white men, where he says that the axis of identity and migration has become more important for modern voters, especially young people, than the axis of economics is for boomers, and is equally important to the emphasis placed on economics during the battles of Cold War of capitalism v socialism under Reagan and Thatcher. Matt understands this. He's understood it for years. And this is his platform. And this is the message that he's trying to force through reform, while reform are tacking towards neoliberal economics and courting lots of foreign investment, especially from Abu Dhabi. Continuing, it is primarily a narrative rooted in fears of destruction. In Hungary, Orban presents refugees as Muslim invasion force. In France, Le Pen warns the whole of France will become a gigantic no-go zone. In Austria, Heinz Christian Strache tells voters unless they end the policy of Islamization, Europeans will come to an abrupt end. In the Netherlands, Geert Wilders warns Europe will cease to exist if it does not slow the growth of Islam. And in Italy, the leader of the Italian League, Matteo Salvini, warns that centuries of Europe's history are at risk of disappearing if Islamization, which up until now has been underestimated, gains the upper hand. Again, our complaints that reform is too capitulatory to the Muslim demographic are not represented by Matt Goodwin. He also makes a very sound argument later on in the book against mass immigration, and says that arguments for resisting demographic change for its own sake, preserving the integrity of your ethnic community and its culture, are legitimate, and you don't have to just coach your concerns about immigration in economic terms. He says, many on the left continue to misdiagnose the problem. Democrats in America and Social Democrats in Europe maintain this divide is really just about racism or objective economic deprivation. They believe that if they can only give workers more jobs, more growth, and less austerity, then their supporters will return. They refuse to acknowledge that people's concerns about immigration and rapid ethnic change might be legitimate in their own right, and that these are not simply to do with jobs. The more you try and talk about inclusive integration strategies, or economics being the rising tide which lifts all ships and will thereby force integration and resolve any disputes between ethnic groups, you obscure the real nature of the problems caused by demographic and cultural change, which are inevitably downstream of immigration. Again, Matt understands this. The only thing that I had a major problem with in this book is at the time he underestimated the scale of which Muslim migration would be a problem. He wrote, in the short term, Muslims are charged with creating no-go zones, areas dominated by highly conservative interpretations of Islam, which exclude non-Muslims and clamp down on dissent and deviancy, an argument popular among the alt-right in the US, who point to Europe's burgeoning Muslim populations. The thesis, however, involves population projections that most serious analysts regard as exaggerated. Moreover, there is no serious evidence of any Islamic plot to colonize Europe, even if groups like ISIS think it useful to have Muslim refugees on the continent. That said, the idea also plays well on the anti-Muslim sentiment that has developed widely in the West and is likely to find a receptive audience for many years to come. So if you're worried that Matt hasn't changed his mind since that, remember that the research that recently found that white Brits are going to become a minority by 2063 in their own country was conducted by Matt Goodwin. This was in the middle of last year, in 2025. This research was distanced from by Richard Tice, who says, who cares about demographic change? I'll be dead by then. So Matt, again, being firmly on the right of the Reform Party, changing national discourse about demographics, identity, ethnicity, and Islam. And he expresses the growth of the Muslim population as a negative within the Reform Party, which has been quite cozy with Islam, including recently. I've got a stream coming up that I've planned on why Reform's foreign policy is shaped by their desire to win over the Muslim vote, and vice versa, why they're trying to win the Muslim vote in order to advance their foreign policy and attract investment. That's not Matt's chief concern. Matt's chief concern is about demographic change, identity, and immigration. Meaning he's the kind of guy we would actually like to have a bigger stake in steering Reform's ship. Matt found that due to birth and death rates, the white British population will decline from 73% per the 2021 census to 57% by 2050 before slipping into a minority by 2063, before the 1,000-year anniversary of the Battle of Hastings. The research by Matt Goodwin suggests by the end of the century, the white British share of the population will have fallen to 33.7%. By 2100, it predicts 6 in 10 people in the UK will either not have been born in the UK or will have at least one immigrant parent. This, by the way, caused an outraged article to be written in The Independent, which I'll be featuring in a forthcoming essay on the death of civic nationalism to be found on Substack soon. But, again, the fact that people were throwing a tantrum about Matt Goodwin's predictions, the fact that Fraser Nelson called this intolerable racialism at the time and suggested that Farage should denounce himself from Goodwin, and Goodwin is now a candidate, is, again, positive. I'm seeing super chats coming in, by the way. I will address super chats at the end of the show. No matter what the questions are, I will answer them. If you do send a super chat in, make sure to ask me a question, because you'll get your money's worth. Goodwin says, the Muslim population, which stands at 7%, it's higher. It's hard to gather data on illegals, houses of multiple occupancy, and places that don't speak English. But it's set to increase to more than 1 in 10, so 11%, within the next 25 years, and 1 in 5, 19%, by 2100. So, a 20% Muslim population is a problem for Matt Goodwin. A growing Muslim population is a problem for Matt Goodwin. Therefore, he is a bulwark against the softening within reform. All very positive. In his report, Matt said, the findings are certain to spark a considerable degree of anxiety, concern, and political opposition among many voters who favoured lowering immigration and slowing the pace of change in order to maintain the symbols, traditions, culture, and ways of life of the traditional majority group. Now, of course, we would like to reverse a lot of that change, but at the very least, this is, remember, this was middle of last year, this is yet another movement towards changing the framing to catch up with what the majority of the British public want, which is large numbers of immigrants who have already settled here to leave, according to YouGov polling. There's actually a larger share of people that want that than currently vote for reform. So, all this is encouraging. Then Matt wrote an article in the days following or the month after, to interpret his findings. And he says, Britain will be unrecognisable by the end of this century. Unless things change and change fast, the population of the UK will be permanently transformed by mass migration. White Britons will become a minority by the year 2063. The foreign-born and their immediate descendants will become a majority by 2079. Nearly 1 in 4 in the UK will be following Islam by the year 2100. This figure would rise to around 1 in 3 among under 40s. So the demographic pyramid will be heavily weighted towards Islam. Many people struggle to make sense of the pace and scale of these changes. They'll ask how a nation could be transformed this fast without the consent of the governed. And he says, the findings from the Office for National Statistics are indeed shocking. More than 1 in 3 babies born in England and Wales last year have mothers who were not born in the UK. This rises to more than 40% for babies in England, a record high and up by nearly 10 points in less than a decade. And the number 1 baby name in England is, of course, Mohammed. London is at the forefront of these dramatic shifts. All 6 areas where 80% or more of babies have at least one foreign-born parent are now in the capital. Such is the legacy of mass immigration, which began under New Labour, who said that they wanted to rub the right's nose in diversity and render its arguments out of date, according to Blair's speechwriter Andrew Nether, and was then mainstreamed by the Tories. If you exclude London, the one place in the country that has the highest share of babies who have at least one foreign-born parent is Luton, where Tommy Robinson is from, which is why Matt says they're a similar age and he now understands where it's coming from. And Matt once said to me, the winning question to ask anyone who is uncomfortable about questions of demographic change is, the vision of the future is Luton. Do you want to live in Luton? If not, why not? And if they can't answer it, you know they're being dishonest. In Luton, the figure is 79% of babies who have at least one foreign-born parent. There are now dozens of local areas across England, ignored in the wider debate about immigration, but where more than half of babies have at least one, if not 2, foreign-born parents. From Southampton to Derby, Reading to Milton Keynes, a majority of all babies in so many of our towns and cities are now born to at least one foreign-born parent. Again, these are terms that not many people in reform speak in. Matt is their candidate. He is platformed on GB News, written up in the Telegraph, has a debate with Michael Gove published by The Spectator. You know, all things that I'm banned from doing, but Matt is saying the exact same thing that I say, that someone like Carl says, that many of you will say on X. So, all good. He says, why does this matter? Who cares if the ethnic makeup of the country is undergoing such an extraordinary transformation? It matters for 3 reasons. For the start, this issue goes to the heart of our democracy. We didn't vote for this. We have a political system and a ruling class that is no longer responsive to an electorate that has, for much of the last 30 years, been consistent in asking for less immigration and slower demographic change. How can Britain continue to pride itself on being a democracy when the political elites continue to ignore the wishes of the majority? Telegraph needs a copy editor. But, again, sounds exactly like what I would say. Mass immigration also matters for a more profound reason. It changes how we talk and think about Britishness and Englishness. With the foreign-born and their descendants now forecast to become a majority, the country will be reshaped around a population that has a much thinner sense of national identity. With no real sense of ancestry, most people will be unable to trace their lineage on these islands back more than one generation or two, and we will have no deep roots in our national culture, collective memory, shared history, identity, and way of life. What will this do to the social contract and unity of the nation-state? How really can you unify a people who will have no sense of shared history or cultural inheritance? Translation. To the people who don't get it. Integration is impossible without unquestionably secure demographic foundations, which mean the native population, to whom the culture is indigenous and intuitive, are the unquestionable majority in their own country. That they possess their own country. That they set the tone for their country. And they choose who gets to come and who gets to stay. And he says, the most obvious reason why I think this all matters, culture. These challenges will be compounded by the fact that the foreign-born now often hail not from Europe, but radically different, if not incompatible cultures from Pakistan and Afghanistan to Iraq. Right, the third world doesn't belong here. That's what Matt Goodwin's saying. Again, if you think he is insufficiently on side, this is his published work for the last few years. He's been making the case for this, by the way, for ages. This is the book that I interviewed him about, first on lotusseaters.com. He was saying, Boris betrayed us, Brexit never got done, mass immigration was the number 1 issue for people that voted for Brexit and for Boris. There is a political realignment underway with dispossessed voters from the Red Wall voting not for economic liberalism, but for a party which gets to grips with the questions of somewhere Britain, of identity, of immigration, of culture, of ending the demographic revolving door, and that there needs to be a party that exists that uses his book as basically a Bible. That's what he believes about reform. As a candidate, he's going to be pushing that. As an MP, he's going to have a lot more bargaining power to set the direction of travel for the party that, until something changes, mind you, is going to be the next government. So it is strategically sensible to position him where he has the most influence. Now, there is the counter case, and I'll do this briefly. But there is the counter case, and I wanted to feature it because there are people who are suspicious of Matt who are in my audience, and it would feel unfair to not give that a hearing, including World by Wolf, who I'm sure is watching. And it's not like there isn't ample evidence that allows one to be suspicious of Matt's conversion. Now, I've personally asked him about it back when I used to host Deprogram for the New Culture Forum. By the way, that show, I've been informed, has ended following Peter Whittle's passing and New Culture Forum coming under new management. I don't know if I'm going to appear on New Culture Forum again, but I'm grateful for Peter Whittle for having given me that opportunity. So there you go. But when Matt appeared on the New Culture Forum, we did raise this with him, and we said, look, you've had quite the change, going from, for example, in 2015, writing in The Guardian about how Islamophobia is not being sufficiently fought by the then Conservative government, belonging to Baroness Saida Vorsi, whose deputy, by the way, Richard Chalk, ran Raiku, the Don't Look Back in Anger department. He joined her working group on Islamophobia. He was saying, Islamophobia does not only affect British Muslims, it plays directly into the hands of extremists who claim that Western societies will never accept Islam and its followers. It's for this reason that Saida Vorsi worked hard to form a government working group on anti-Muslim hatred. Matt was one of 2 academics appointed to the group to research the drivers of anti-Muslim hatred and how to build bridges between the research community, government, and British Muslims. He said it was an unpleasant 4 years because he wasn't listened to in government, so he worked on this for 4 years. And he said, the task force consulted widely with the Quilliam Foundation, which was a think tank founded by Majid Nawaz and Ed Hussein, who wrote Among the Mosques, who themselves are Muslims. who is a friend of Nigel Farage, and who in 2017 published research that found that the majority of perpetrators of the Pakistani grooming gangs were ethnically Pakistani Muslims. And they were condemned by the Home Office, by the media, by the government, and ultimately have been vindicated. Quilliam is now shut down because of that condemnation, but they did good work. Matt was counter-signaling them then. And he said, after 3 years of pushing against what often felt like an extremely cold and closed door, he resigned from the group on anti-Muslim hatred and is planning to continue his work to fight Islamophobia. Now, I brought this up to Matt during our deprogrammed episode, and he said he has come a long way. It was the betrayal of the Brexit vote that made him realise that the government was getting something wrong, that there was actually a reasonable concern about immigration, multiculturalism, and that it was the birth of his daughter that made him worried about her future as a minority in her own country being persecuted by men who treat women like bits of meat. And also, he said, the reason that he was, at the time, counteracting right-wing populist parties like the BNP or movements like the EDL, arguing with Tommy Robinson on the BBC, is because he was worried it would discredit the efforts to address these problems properly. Now, whether or not you find Matt's argument convincing there depends on whether or not you have read his extensive published work since, and whether or not you think that he has put in the sufficient hours on GB News, on his Substack, as a Reform candidate, defending Reform in the 2024 unheard hustings, writing his various books. Depends whether or not you believe that that is sincere. Again, having spoken to him privately, the fact that he's been supportive of my work has given me opportunities. At one point, wanted me involved in Reform before, I think he would characterise it as I was incapable of keeping my mouth shut on things I didn't like. The fact that he did all that may vouch for his sincerity. But it doesn't help that there is a number of reports online that people can point and cite that suggest the contrary. For example, this paper from Chatham House, in which Matt was suggesting ways for countering populist parties. And I believe it was on page... So in the executive summary, he describes populist parties as one of the most pressing challenges to European democracies. So the existence of populist parties are themselves a violation of democracy. This was written, I believe, in 2011? Yes, September 2011. So again, about 14 years ago. Pretty significant. But I'm trying to steelman the case. He said, they fiercely oppose immigration, rising ethnic and cultural diversity. They pursue a populist anti-establishment strategy that attacks mainstream parties and is ambivalent, if not hostile, towards liberal representative democracy. So, it seems that Matt pretty comprehensively understands the populist pitch and has moved from combating it to actually adopting it wholesale and becoming almost an avatar of it. In the process, the parties have challenged mainstream parties on the centre, right and left. Some argue their rise has instigated a contagion from the right by pushing moderate right-wing parties to adopt increasingly restrictive policies on immigration and integration. The reason I highlighted that passage, ladies and gents, is if Matt's conversion is sincere, then isn't that what he's capable of doing by being an MP for Reform? Let's say that Reform consider themselves a centre-right party, which is what Nigel Farage and Chairman David Bull say. And we think that Reform is insufficiently strident on immigration. It doesn't have good policy yet. It doesn't always frame its arguments in the right way. See Danny Kruger or David Bull's interviews, or Layla Cunningham calling me and Dan Wootton far right. Let's say that their operating software requires an update. Well, is Matt Goodwin not the perfect person to enact this contagion from the right effect from within Reform? I would argue yes. But anyway, this paper continues. Contrary to the conventional wisdom that these citizens are motivated by feelings of economic competition from immigrants and minority groups, feelings of cultural threat are the most important driver of their support. For these citizens, the decisive motive is feeling that immigration and rising diversity threaten their national culture, the unity of their community and way of life. Much like other voters, citizens who support populist parties are not irrational. They are guided by clear and coherent goals. They want immigration reduced and rising diversity curtailed or halted altogether. They are deeply concerned about these issues and profoundly dissatisfied with the current response offered by mainstream parties. It sounds like Matt, even in 2011, comprehensively understood the position of national populist parties, well ahead of writing his book on the subject, while he was debating Tommy Robinson about it, and has realised, having charitably articulated the arguments for the populist parties and the reason why they attract so much support, oh, they're actually kind of right. So, even within his paper about countering the parties, he has the same rhetoric about the party he now belongs to and is running as an MP for. And so it seems that he actually just studied it and realised that they were correct when his recommendations for what self-declared centrist parties should do to address the issues that populist parties were talking about failed to manifest. He says, their potential for support is evident in 3 areas: public attitudes on immigration, growing hostility towards settled Muslim communities, public dissatisfaction with mainstream parties and their performance on immigration-related issues. The elite are out of touch and need to be replaced. Mass immigration is an existential threat to Britain. The growth of the Islamic demographic in Britain is the most dangerous subsidiary of the problems caused by mass immigration. All of these are problems he's now articulated in his own research about demographics. It is 1-to-1. Very interesting. So look, you can see why people are worried that now he's just basically playing the part of a national populist that he said should be countered way back in 2011. I actually think, again, knowing Matt, that he engaged with the material and realised they were right. So he proposed 6 potential response strategies for mainstream parties to counter populist parties. Exclusion, blocking them from public office and influencing debate, the attempt to ban the AfD in Germany, for example. But he says, this doesn't work. Actually, the opposite tends to be true. Parties are excluded and then tend to adopt more extreme positions and then gain traction. So don't do that. Diffuse the populist message by seeing mainstream parties shift the focus onto issues they have a strategic advantage. And this is what the Conservatives are currently trying to do. And it isn't working, and Matt basically predicted the implosion of the Conservative Party by moving away from immigration because Reform have effectively become, even if they aren't strong enough for us yet, the anti-immigration party. He says, politicians would play down social and cultural issues that tend to favour populist parties like immigration and play up more traditional issues that tend to favour established parties, the economy. That's currently what Francis Maude and Henry Newman and the Conservative scions like Danny Finkelstein are advising Kemi Badenoch to do, and it isn't working. Kemi isn't working, how ironic. However, given the increased salience of immigration and integration in the minds of voters in 2011, this strategy is profoundly unsustainable. Okay. Adoption would entail embracing more restrictive policies in immigration, integration, and law and order. This is the Fraser-Nelson strategy of containment. It is unlikely, however, that such a rightward turn would satisfy the underlying concerns of those citizens who sympathise with the populist extremist message, and it might even compromise underlying traditions of tolerance and pluralism. So basically, centre-right parties can't cosplay as authentic populist parties, which is actually the problem Reform has at the moment by admitting so many Tories, because it looks like the Tories are just coming into Reform to cosplay as anti-establishment while being responsible for causing all these messes. And look, I quite like Robert Jenrick, being frank. I think he's also an authentic convert. His trigonometry interview was very good. But the perception, especially among Red Wall voters, the kinds of voters profiled by Matt in this paper, in National Populism, in Values, Voice and Virtue, the sofa voters who voted Brexit, voted Boris, used to vote Labour, didn't vote Starmer, want to vote Reform, are put off by this perception that Tories are just pantomiming as populists. Matt basically called this back in 2011. The principal strategy, he says, would involve political debate with populist parties, but in a way that is consistent with the evidence on what is driving public concerns. Mainstream elites need to go beyond making the economic case for immigration and begin making the case for cultural diversity. How did that work out for that Indian Labour MP saying, well, Matt's not actually British because he doesn't embrace diversity? It backfires spectacularly. So, this effort to counter was basically an inadvertent suggestion to sabotage your own efforts at arguing against anti-immigration parties. Because the more immigration increases, the more costs and crimes inflicted by largely third world migration become salient in the public mind. You can't argue against the UKification of the UK on the grounds that it is aesthetically preferable or economically prosperous, or even that there is a democratic mandate for it. Trying to argue the merits of diversity when people are getting stabbed is always doomed to fail. The final strategy, last two strategies, he suggests, is engagement, serious investment in countering populist campaigns at grassroots. So it just means upping your local election efforts. Well, look at what the Labour Party are doing. Look at what the Greens are doing. Doesn't look like it's going to succeed against Goodwin. Lastly, interaction. Much greater effort devoted to supporting contact and dialogue between different ethnic and cultural groups within a community, though especially between members of the majority and minority Muslim communities. Now, I wonder if, and I have no insider knowledge here to confirm this, I wonder if Matt's actually had a conversation with the Internal Reform Party, saying, I wrote the playbook on how to counter populists, why don't we flip it on its head? And Reform have internalised this as meaning, well, we can make inroads with the Muslim vote, including via Marja Nawaz, including via Zia Yusuf and Layla Cunningham, including by courting investment from Abu Dhabi. And we can get the moderate Muslim vote on our side. Because it seems like Reform's actually doing all of this, actually. They're distancing themselves from the populist label while incorporating elements of populism into their party platform. They are denouncing those considered more extremist than themselves to win a hypothetical centre ground, which now encompasses anti-mass migration rhetoric, and they're trying to copy the ground game of the Liberal Democrats. Though Zia Yusuf has been buggering that up by cutting loose their branches. So I do wonder if, actually, accidentally, Matt writing the playbook on how to counter populist parties is now being used as the playbook for success in the populist party he has joined because he has been convinced of the merits of populist arguments. So this would actually be a argument against Matt just being an insincere infiltrator. But, again, people are concerned. And one of the chief concerns, which is valid, is because Matt did used to work with Hope Not Hate. Right. So, this is why Nick Lowles hates him. This is why Matt Goodwin had like a 3-page splash in the last State of Hate report. I'm now trying to compete with Matt for more page space in Hope Not Hate. I'm further right than you, Matt. It's unfair that Hope Not Hate gave you a more extensive write-up than me. They just gave me a named mention in the State of Hate report. I didn't even get my own page. I didn't get a photo. Maybe I should wear the quarter zip next time. But Matt did actually write a paper with Hope Not Hate, back when Hope Not Hate were a subsidiary of Searchlight. However, can you spot the interesting logo here, ladies and gentlemen? YouGov. YouGov, for those that don't know, were founded by Mr. Nadim Zahawi. Yes, the same Nadim Zahawi who was the vaccine minister in Boris Johnson's cabinet, the same Nadim Zahawi who resigned as Conservative Party chairman for sort of tax scandal. The same Nadim Zahawi who recently defected to Reform UK and is being positioned as their shadow foreign secretary. So, Nadim Zahawi and YouGov were working with Hope Not Hate in the early 2010s. I am much more concerned about Nadim Zahawi's presence in Reform than Matt Goodwin, because Matt Goodwin has, I think, thoroughly repented for his time working with the enemy, whereas Nadim Zahawi remains unapologetic about being a member of Boris Johnson's cabinet, is pro-migration, was pro a mass illegal migrant amnesty, is unrepentant about vaccine passports and the vaccine rollout, and, likely, would call figures like me far right. So, I am far more concerned, based on this paper, about Nadim Zahawi's presence, but there you go. And then there was discussion about the launch of his paper in 2011. And yes, that is with Nick Lowles. This was all for Chatham House. Now, it was also with... Where was the other document? There was another document. There's a launch document. Here it is. There's also another discussion in 2011 with John Cruddas. Now, John Cruddas is a former Labour MP who is now chairing the Independent Committee on Community Cohesion after the Southport riots, with Sajid Javid, who said so what about demographic change, Fraser Nelson, need not elaborate, and Dame Sarah Khan, the same Dame Sarah Khan whose sister helped run Raiku and who prefabricated the image of a Union Jack hijab to run on the front page of The Sun after Alan Henning was beheaded by ISIS. The same Dame Sarah Khan, who in 2024 was working with Hope Not Hate to produce a paper on anti-extremism that obsessed about Andrew Tate and led to now this new strategy by the Cabinet Office to monitor people's social media posts and the Department of Education's new anti-misogyny curriculum. So, yes, this entire network was noxious, and Matt was entrenched in it. And Matt did write some various silly remarks throughout. On page 17, I believe it was one of the worst offences. Matt said, "We need to think about, okay, how do we begin to make the broader cultural argument about immigration and rising diversity? Because the simple reality is that rising diversity is now largely inevitable. But European electorates remain largely hostile to this process." Again, awful rhetoric. But I don't think that you can say this is still Matt's opinion after he was the guy who did the research that found the date at which we would become a minority in our own country. So I think Matt has thoroughly changed his mind on this. However, there are still people who, again, World by Wolf has been posting frequently about this on X, are skeptical that Matt is some sort of intelligence plant, perhaps, or saboteur who has learned the playbook of thwarting populist parties, and so is entering and trying to gum up the works from the inside. I mean, he's noted in this document that government minister said Goodwin helped to develop government policy to counter the far right or prevent. You know, take it from me, I am one of the most vocal prevent critics in the country, remember? I've done lots of work on the Islamic network capturing prevent, so I am not happy about this, and provided government with substantial evidence base which continues to change and inform policy. Also, this includes Goodwin was approached and engaged by over 80 non-academic bodies in North America. These include the National Intelligence Council, Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, and the Council of Europe, European Parliament, and Open Society Foundation. So again, Matt did work with some very subversive foreign intelligence agencies and George Soros. Not great. And he contributed directly to policy thinking and development, according to Claire Gibson, the head of Prevent. Again, not a good record in the early 2010s. But what I think is important here is that if and hopefully when Matt becomes an MP, the first thing that Matt should do to alleviate all doubt, which I'm sure people in chat will still have, right? And in the comments, especially if I upload this to Rumble, because blimey, I thought YouTube comments were schizophrenic. It's like a public bathroom wall in there. I think the best strategy for Matt to alleviate doubts among the base that actually do want the kind of national populist party that he has so eloquently articulated deserves to exist, is to immediately pressure the relevant parliamentary committee. I think probably the best committee for it would be the Home Affairs Committee. Not that they've got great representatives on there, but pressure it. Into a full spectrum investigation into the nefarious activity of Hope Not Hate, hiring paedophiles, hiring violent thugs like Matthew Collins, their deep connections with the Attorney General and the Prime Minister, access to Downing Street, the fact that they have, despite hiring, again, a convicted paedophile, and not the only criminal that they had on staff, a parliamentary working group. They are protected by the Home Office. They enjoyed funding from the Home Office under the last Conservative government. They have police connections. A full spectrum investigation into Hope Not Hate to get this group, hopefully, prescribed and prosecuted for the crimes they've committed would alleviate any doubt in the mind of erstwhile reform supporters and Goodwin voters that he is in some way insufficiently wedded to the cause. I think that's a conciliatory measure, don't you? And let me mostly finish on this. It's not like people are irrational to worry about intelligence infiltration into these national populist parties. Because it happened before, it happened in the 1990s, and it happened to UKIP. I promise you, this is not a schizo post. As Douglas Murray reported in 2013, based on an old article in The Spectator by Norman Tebbit in 2001, MI6 seems to have infiltrated and sabotaged UKIP, and also the referendum party. This is well substantiated. As Murray points out, on the 25th of May 2001, The Spectator published a piece by Norman Tebbit. Tebbit recounts 2 serving or former British intelligence agents who infiltrated Jimmy Goldsmith's referendum party and then UKIP. Tebbit gives examples of how UKIP's efforts were derailed during the period in which these agents were inside the party. It is important to stress, before directing you to the Tebbit piece below, it's not a conspiracy theory. So long as it was British government policy to seek further integration into the EU, parties like UKIP posed a threat to perceived British interests. So, if a party was, for example, going to push for the independence of the Bank of England and the Treasury regulating bond markets, if a party was going to push, for example, for net negative migration, regardless of the modelled economic impact that might have, and remember, ministers don't get to do their own economic modelling. Economic modelling is handed to them by the Treasury and the Office for Budget Responsibility, upon which they have to make policy, and upon which they have to set national security priorities that then inform the activity of the security state. If a party were proposing those policies, do you not think that the intelligence agencies would attempt to infiltrate and sabotage said party? It's not impossible. It's happened before. And Douglas is right to be continually worried about this for reform. And I'm sure that someone has let reform know to be very vigilant about this. I'm not suggesting this is Matt, but I am saying that people that are worried about entryism, worried about infiltration and containment, sabotage by the intelligence agencies, they are not wrong to be worried about that. And that is why I've included this, because I do not want you to think that I am leading you up the garden path by saying I think Matt Goodwin's conversion is sincere, or that there is nothing to worry about regarding the infiltration and sabotage of political parties. So in Tebbit's piece, he said he met an ex-employee of UKIP who told him the party had been infiltrated by MI6, and he thought he was mad. And he claimed, the employee, that the party veered away from a policy of standing against Europhile MPs to one of standing in seats where a Tory MP might be ousted or a Tory candidate might be kept out, however good their Eurosceptic credentials might be. Such seats in the West Country, where the arch-sceptic Patrick Nichols has a majority of only 281 over the Liberal Democrats, with 13,000 Labour votes available to be squeezed. UKIP polled 1,600 and has no chance of winning, but maintain their candidate will take votes from the Lib Dems and Labour, not from Patrick Nichols, which Tebbit found hard to believe. Then there were 2 names provided to him. The informant had no proof, but believed they had links to a British intelligence service. Somewhat half-heartedly, he made his own inquiries and struck gold. And I have been informed, that it's because he knew people that were ex-security details for members, high-ranking members of the British state, who he ran the names past, and they said, I recognise them, they used to be in MI6. So, he rang up UKIP, challenged one, and said, oh, by the way, are you or have you ever been a member of MI6? Click, phone went down. Denial came, there none. Only an angry retort that I should be ashamed of myself for asking such a question. The agency, of course, does not answer those questions because it doesn't want to compromise its field assets. And he says, I'm perfectly sure that the individuals had been active agents, although both would claim to have retired some years ago well before joining UKIP. The conspiracy theory was given a boost when I discovered this week that during the 1997 election, both individuals worked for Jimmy Goldsmith's referendum party. The first then promptly recruited the other. So, in the referendum party and in UKIP, intelligence assets were getting work and then employing other intelligence assets to work on the party from the inside, changing the party's priorities to stand in unwinnable seats. I had, for example, heard that not long after the 2024 general election, there were people within Reform saying stop talking about immigration, doesn't poll very well. And they were using outmoded polling data. Now, it could just be they were using bad polling data, or it could be they had ulterior motives to sabotage the party's electoral prospects. After 1997, both individuals moved to UKIP, Tebbit notes. One is still there. I understand the other resigned his post some 3 months ago, having lost the confidence of his colleagues, so he was pushed out. I do not believe the leaders of UKIP were aware of the background of these people when they were employed. He notes, since Attlee's Labour government helped create NATO, all three major parties have agreed that membership of that alliance is in the British national interest. Through the 50s, 60s and 70s, those opposing membership were regarded as misguided and possibly subversive. So a party whose sole raison d'etre is Britain's withdrawal might be regarded as subversive. Already New Labour equates patriotism with membership and describes calls withdrawal as unpatriotic regarding the European Union. So, if membership of the European Union was considered an unquestionable strategic advantage for the British security state, and that was the pretext by which they infiltrated UKIP, would not diversity being our strength, mass immigration being an economic good, the independence of the Bank of England and of the civil service be considered strategic security goals that would warrant infiltration by the security state? I wish this was not possible. I wish it was beyond the bounds of us discussing. I wish this was up there with, saying that Jeffrey Epstein was writing ball on his bank statements when it turns out to be a smudge, right? I wish it was up there with all of the unsubstantiated claims about Donald Trump engaging in ritualistic sacrifice, or George Bush Sr. eating out some guy's intestines, right? I wish it was up there with saying Epstein transformed into a lizard person before everyone's very eyes, which distracted from, of course, the truthful narrative that he was an Israeli intelligence asset who mysteriously came into lots of money and then ran an international blackmail ring with the collaboration seemingly of the Russians as well as Jewish ethnic supremacists who didn't like white people very much and tried to gain compromise on pretty much every celebrity and politician, billionaire and influential media mogul that he could get his hands on, including Bill Gates, who may or may not have gotten an STD from a Russian prostitute. I wish it was just, the lizard person stuff, but it's looking a lot more like all the rest, right? It's looking possible. And so I just want people to be hyper vigilant for entryism and for sabotage. Now, final couple of points about reform, because people have their reservations. And then we'll get on to super chats, because I've talked your ear off long enough. It's nearly a 2-hour show. Reform are still making some blunders. For example, they've got this woman who is just speaking Urdu. That's Shakina Khan, who has defected from the Conservatives to Reform UK. She's a former Conservative councillor candidate, I think it was. So yet again, another political grifter from the Indian subcontinent, like that Bangladeshi candidate they were running, from Egypt, Layla Cunningham. She's now a campaign branch manager. This isn't what people voted for. This is not actually what Matt Goodwin represents. So this is bad. Stop it. And Farage has said, yet again, that he expects many more Muslims to vote for him. Totally delusional. And it turns out that the white working class reform voting demographic, who overwhelmingly think that being Muslim is incompatible with being British, winning that vote is mutually exclusive from winning the Muslim vote. So knock it off. And also, they've brought in Ben Goldsmith, don't know why the image isn't loading, to be a consultant on their nature strategy. Now, that name might not mean a lot to you. He is the brother of Zach Goldsmith, the former London mayoral candidate for the Conservatives who ran against Sadiq Khan. And their sister is Jemima Goldsmith, who was married to the former Prime Minister of Pakistan. And she founded the New Statesman as well. But the reason that I know Ben Goldsmith is twofold. In 2022 or 2021, he spoke at a conference and he said the Thames Frost Fair, when the Thames used to freeze over and the Victorians used to go skating on it and host a fun fair on it, was caused by the fictional genocide of American Indian tribes, because that somehow lowered the global CO2 emission rate to cause the Thames to freeze over. I think that happened about the same time that hell froze over as well. So just total shitlib climate cultist fictions. And also, and this is reported in The Guardian, he supported Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion sitting in the road and blocking trains. And he said they were right to be doing whatever it takes to wake people up. So Ben Goldsmith is a demented climate cultist who undoubtedly will write his delusions into Reform's environmental policy. They should be consulting Andrew Montford and all the other lads at Net Zero Watch instead. And they should be even going internationally, speaking to the American Conservation Coalition, working out bespoke energy export deals with the United States. Instead, they've got this guy who's obsessed with rewilding, which is nice in certain enclosures, but demented when you want to reintroduce wolves back to the English countryside after we got rid of them and made it safe. I don't think Reform needs to be consulting with this guy. I don't think they need Muslim candidates. And the other thing they do need is policy. And the person criticising them for this is Jeremy Clarkson. Now, this is a lot more of a rhetorical piece than it is incisive political commentary, but it's very telling that Nigel Farage personally doesn't pass Jeremy Clarkson's vibe barometer, because Jeremy Clarkson embodies deep English patriotism. Clarkson's Farm is not only the best show to be produced for the last couple of decades, but it's the most quintessentially English show ever put on television, save for perhaps Blackadder. And the fact that Clarkson has become an avatar of the farmers' protests, at which Reform was showing up and speaking, and yet doesn't believe in Reform, should tell Reform that their sales pitch isn't working with the exact kind of people they want to be courting. Jeremy Clarkson should be a champion of Reform, but he's not. Now, I understand that he voted Remain, so he's predisposed to be opposed to those that were on the other side of the Brexit referendum, but he has opposed the ethnic cleansing in the countryside, in those explicit terms. He is against political correctness and wokeness. He got cancelled for his... I can't remember what column it was. Was it Times? For saying that Meghan Markle should have excrement thrown at her in the street, like it's from Game of Thrones. And he was insulting Nicola Sturgeon. So he's far from your average luxury belief Liberal Democrat voter. But what he does take umbrage with is Reform's absent policies on transport, agriculture, which is big for him, education, potholes, health, and smoking in pubs. What does Farage think about China? We do have a sort of foreign policy prospectus from Reform, but it's mainly concentrated in the Middle East, which I'll be covering soon. But the fact that Clarkson is saying that Reform are engaging in thin policy, fantasy economics, and basically relying only on immigration, but because they haven't got a robust policy prospectus, like my friend Harrison Pitt over at Restore Britain has conjured up on his own a far more comprehensive mass deportations document than Reform's entire headquarters have. Clarkson notes, apparently, millions will put their ex in Farage's box against immigration, and the morning after he gets the keys to number 10, they expect to wake up and find themselves in an Enid Blyton picture book. People are getting the sense that they are being sold a false bill of goods by Reform when the output in terms of policy, in terms of messaging, just hasn't been up to scratch. They don't look government ready yet. I'm not saying they can't be, and I think Matt Goodwin would actually go quite a long way to improving what they're offering. But the fact that Clarkson isn't persuaded should tell them that they need to reconsider their messaging strategy. But it is important that Farage doesn't seem like the genuine article to Clarkson. So let's finish on this. Who does? Because we've been speaking, of course, earlier in the show about Advance UK and the fact that they don't have any policies. They keep relying on AI for their messaging and their graphics. Just today, they launched their sort of youth movement thing, which I know young Bob is a part of. It seems like a nice guy. I've only interacted with him once over DMs. I haven't met him. But they used an AI video for it, and it's just like... We've been talking about how they are unlikely to win the Gorton and Denton by-election, but may stop Matt Goodwin from winning it. But no matter what people want Advance to be as an alternative to Reform, it's not quite there yet. The one unaccounted for quantity in this conversation, the farmer that might win over Jeremy Clarkson, even. The one person who the ambient electricity looking to strike a lightning rod of leadership is coalescing around is Mr. Rupert Lowe. And Rupert just did another interview with Peter McCormack on his podcast. And Peter, right out, asked him, do you want to be Prime Minister? And then he said, well, Peter's lost faith with reform, despite Peter being a hardcore reform supporter and considering running as an MP, actually. So that's also pretty important. And Peter, you know, chairman of Bedford Football Club, big on crypto, so he should be in reform's corner, but he's just not enthused about the number of Tories and how they've treated Rupert and some of the rhetoric coming out of Layla Cunningham and Zia Youssef. And instead he asked Rupert, okay, what are you going to do then? And Rupert said, well, we've got the rape gang inquiry. It's underway at the moment. They've been putting out some harrowing clips about it. I may cover it as of next week, but I've been doing some work contributing to some of the findings, mainly around demographics and religion. So that's taken up some of my time off air. That's why I've been a bit quiet on the writing front. But once that's out of the way, Rupert has said that he wants to set up an alternative to reform for the people who have lost faith in reform. I'll allow Rupert to speak for himself before we go to Super Chats.
People often say, well, am I going to join Advance UK? Well, the truth about that is Ben and I did speak to each other. I never agreed to lead Advance UK. We had a big meeting with all of our staff present after I was cleared by the CPS and I was out of reform. Because Ben is a good man, and I think, you know, a lot of what he says is very sensible. I think he's a patriot. I think he does want the best for Britain. But I didn't want a party. As I said to him, a party at that stage was divisive. I wanted a movement, which we've got, and we've got our own fantastically loyal people who support us. And I think they would like to see us now find a solution to delivering this change that you and I think is now necessary. It's going to be hugely hard work. It's going to be very complex. And I don't think any of us can actually say how the course is going to plot itself. But Ben wanted a party. I wanted a movement. Initially, he said he'd support my movement and then we could turn into a party when we were ready to do that. But he decided to set up Advance UK. And I've never ever publicly been anything other than polite and complimentary about Ben, because he's a good man. So, but that was the philosophical difference between us. He didn't want to wait, so he set up Advance. I've set up Restore. And I guess the question is there a way in which those two bodies can work together? And if there isn't, what do we do? And that's the question that is still got to be resolved. And I will resolve that once the rape gang inquiry is done. But I can assure people, I know they want change. I know we've got to do it by 29. And my intention is to try and give people the best opportunity to vote for something fresh, something that is outside the establishment, which is what reform used to be. As we said, when we were first elected, we were against all the odds, and that was a huge achievement by all of us, to actually break into this closed shop. We broke in, and we broke in against all the odds. And when I fought my campaign in Great Yarmouth, I had no idea what great people they are, and I've got to like them hugely. They've been badly let down by the post-war elite, and I'm intent on trying to deliver a solution for everybody, but it's going to require their support. I can't do it. I can set up the opportunity, but then it's up to the British people. If they don't, then I respect that, but I've got to try and deliver a mechanism through which, if they agree with me, that we need radical change, it's got to come from outside the existing political establishment. Then they've got to show that, and they've got to support us, and they've got to trust us, because, I will do my best to change this mess that is this homunculus-like state which is sucking the blood out.
Well, chat, are you in? Are you feeling supportive? Because, just to conclude, I think it is wise for the right to support Matt Goodwin in the Gorton and Denton by-election. I hope Matt wins. I have publicly congratulated him, and I hope that my endorsement does not cause him any problems. But if you are in the area, vote for the guy. If you are not banned like me and you're eligible to canvass, go out and support him. Make sure you've had a shower and worn a suit first. But with the prospect of Rupert Lowe's party on the horizon, I think we can afford to encourage 1,000 flowers blooming. And if Rupert decides to marshal the resources, the talent that Reform has left on the table, occupy the vacant space in the Overton window to their right, and either drags Reform rightward and forces some kind of pact to be made, or at very least forces Reform to try and outbid Rupert for being the right-wing party, then we get exactly what we want. And Rupert's already doing magnificent work as an independent MP, and, well, Restore Britain will have another Overton window shattering policy paper by yours truly, coming very soon. Anyway, thank you all. I will get round to your super chats now, so I will quickly respond to those. I agree with Landa, by the way. God bless Rupert Lowe. He's a very good man. I'll be seeing Rupert very soon. Thank you to CCCC Kid for joining the membership scheme. I don't really know how YouTube memberships work. I just know that people are gracious enough to support me, and there's a button that allows me to put out videos early for members. So I schedule them for like a set time, otherwise the YouTube algorithm screws me over. But I'll allow members to watch it early because apparently that doesn't impact the algorithm. YouTube is very opaque. Please understand that I'm doing everything myself and it's kind of scuffed. I appreciate your patience. $20 from Alex says, this might sound unrelated, but it is very easy to criticize the global homo gay race communism. However, what is the vision for the future? How do we balance Christianity with the market? Tradcath feudalism coming back? God bless. I mean, that's going to take a lot longer than just the space in the end of this broadcast to answer, but answering the specific question about how you balance Christianity with the market, you allow Christianity to be the moral guardrails to inform legislation and also to minimize the amount of state enforcement required because you have a virtuous, self-governing populace. This is a point actually Christopher Lash made in Revolt of the Elites, which inspired Goodwin. Republics, in the American sense, are only possible if the people themselves are sufficiently cultivated to be self-governing. They are Christian, they are well-educated, they are conscious of their own ethnocultural identities. And they can delay gratification to pass off the proceeds of their labour as patrimony to their descendants, to their children. And so the way that we use Christianity is to say we can have free enterprise as we had in Britain at the zenith of our civilization, the Victorian Age and the Industrial Revolution in many respects. We use Christianity to means test our charity, so we redress poverty according to injustice. People through no fault of their own have fallen on hard times rather than allowing the welfare state to be a replacement for some reckless woman's husband. And we allow Christianity to guide us in placing prohibitions on behaviours and the remit of the market. For example, we should ban surrogacy. You shouldn't be able to not just commodify a woman's body, but a child's. Human beings are not to be bought and sold. And so, given we're all made in the image of God, we are capable, so long as we remain innocent, of equal moral dignity, manifesting that equal moral dignity through our actions and our virtues, not just by being blank slates. Because we can recognize that fact, we can ban surrogacy. We can ban abortion. We can ban lethal, toxic drugs. Or, frankly, I'm happy to continue banning weed because it makes you just fat, lazy, and retarded. So those sorts of things can actually inform the market. We can place social and cultural guardrails on the remit of the economy in order to allow for human flourishing and ordering the passions towards virtue and building sustainable lives. Anyway, that was a long answer, but you did send me a $20 super chat, so thank you. Lone Wolf and Cub for $2. It was not preached by the state. I'm not sure what that's a quote from. Dilby for £2. Sorry. What do we think of mandatory voting? I'm pro. I'm against. Barely anyone should vote. I'm against mass democracy. Like, I think at most it should be 1 vote per household, per married property owning household. Other than that, I'm like Anakin. I'm not big on democracy these days. Leowolf the Red for $5. I'm American here, 47% English, 38% Scandinavian, the rest British, Celt, and Slavic, and I have more of a right to live in England than the Third World. Absolutely. I'm actually in favour, once we rectify our fractured demographic situation and engage in remigration of people that aren't wanted here, I am in favour of a Anglo right to return policy for Australia, America, Canada, and New Zealand. I'm not saying I want to strip mine those great countries of all of their heritage populations that actually built the countries, but we are a global minority. We are an endangered species. And in order to subsidize our depleted population in the aftermath of ethnocidal policies like mass migration and Muslim terror attacks, much like Israel did after the Second World War and the Holocaust, I would encourage Anglos to return to the motherland and begin replenishing it. Do your duty. From CSS for £20. Thank you very much, sir. Very generous. English, Irish, Scottish, and Welsh men have only one wife. Should this be made mandatory for all who live here in the UK? I think what you mean is you want to prescribe polygamy, not forced marriage, which is actually, ironically, more Islamic. Yes, I would... This is one of the areas, the policy research areas that I'm happy to look into, particularly a ban on cousin marriage. I think Patrick Nash's work has been great on that, but it would be great to actually draft the legislation. I think that we should be banning polygamy. However, the problem is most Islamic marriages are not licensed by the state. They take place in off-the-book Sharia courts, and we have the most Sharia courts operating in any country in all of Europe here in Britain. So I would just make it a criminal penalty. But I would also make these off-the-book Sharia courts and a parallel legal system also a criminal penalty. I basically want to make it a complete hostile environment for incompatible cultures and religions to set up sectarian enclaves in our country. And finally, from Johnny, $10. Much, I assume you mean love, from America. I hope we can save not just our nations, but civilization as a whole. Well, that's certainly the opinion of the State Department. I know that the State Department are currently touring Europe again, giving some speeches about the shared plight of Western civilization defined as Athens, Rome, and Bethlehem, and the Anglosphere in Western Europe, and I'll add Japan in there as well because I love the country, and us being demographically swamped by foreign criminals who, even if they practice their faith and culture peacefully, will not recreate our civilization. The Americans are just as concerned about it as we are, and it's great to have allies, and hopefully we can engage in some more transatlantic ventures and news coverage soon. But anyway, I will go and have dinner with my wife, who forgot her keys and apparently texted me midway through the broadcast, and she arrived like an hour ago, so she must have gone and got a spare set or something. She's currently cooking dinner. God bless her. Thank you all very much for watching. In the meantime, you can follow me on X at @con_Tomlinson. You hopefully have subscribed. If not, hit the notification bell. Give the video a thumbs up, clip it, share it on Reddit, trigger people. We love to upset our political nemesis here. Subscribe to the Substack, etc. All-round promotion, and, you know, give our mutuals some love. Go subscribe to Lander on X. He hasn't got, as well, enough followers on X. He's a solid poster. So go help your mutuals out. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening. Take care, God bless, and goodbye.